This is Troy Black, and Doug Smith is with me today, and we're going to be having a conversation about Candace Owens because she just said something that has completely changed the way that we're able to view and look at the claims that she's making. And I believe this is a very important conversation to have. So I'm a Christian, Doug's a Christian, so we're going to be looking at it from that perspective, but we're going to be trying to also give a more broad overview as well. How do we respond to Candace Owens saying that she had a dream and that Charlie Kirk, who was recently assassinated, came to her in the dream? So this is the quote from this video from yesterday. And she says, I similarly, like I just said, had a vivid dream this weekend, and Charlie came to me and he told me that he was betrayed. You don't have to believe that, but I do believe that. And it was the immediate sense I got, actually. And I don't know who exactly it is that betrayed him, but I also felt in the dream that it is going to be revealed, that it's actually inevitable, that it's going to be revealed, that there is nothing and no one that is going to stop the truth from coming out, and that it's going to have international consequences. So we'll get into a little bit more about what she said in a little bit. But essentially what's happened is Candace Owens has brought a lot of different allegations. You know, many people are familiar. We don't have to get into everything she said, but, you know, about the Charlie Kirk situation. And so far she's brought some allegations that have evidence, some that don't, but maybe with a promise of evidence. There have been a few things that she said that I believe have been debunked. Doug, feel free to push back in a little bit on that if you want to, but we're really not going to talk about like the evidence side of this today. We're going to have a conversation about how do we respond to Candace saying, hey, I've had a dream, and what do we do with that? Right. Well, it's very interesting because this, I believe, breaks open a whole nother realm, you know, no pun intended, of thinking when it comes to an influencer like this. Now, Candace claims to be a Christian, you know, so she's religious, you know, she's a Catholic. And so spirituality is involved in her life, right? But it's interesting the world that we live in today, where there's almost a divide between spirituality and the natural, typically. And when someone says, someone like this, who you expect as an investigative journalist and influencer, you expect them to bring receipts, you expect them to bring evidence and clues and all these things. And then they say, hey, I had a dream and I'm going with that. It's like it raises questions that weren't raised previously. So here's an interesting thought. Okay, this is where my brain went, is there were a lot of humanistic intellectual thinkers in the early 1900s, specifically around that time, who started saying, hey, because of where we are with science, because of where we are with humanity, religion will ultimately be a thing of the past. And they started saying we're going to be pushing more and more in the modern world, the modern age, and especially postmodern, we're going to be pushing away from spirituality and into naturalism. Like the humanistic worldview is going to win out. And this is Neil deGrasse Tyson posting in 2024 on Facebook, and he's quoting Bertrand Russell. He says, it says, religion is something left over from the infancy of our intelligence. It will fade away as we adopt reason and science as our guidelines. And then here's another quote. Religion was an early attempt to answer the questions we all ask. Why are we here? Where do we come from? He says, it says, today science proves better and more consistent answers. Okay. And that's a quote from Stephen Hawking. And so it's very interesting that what we're seeing is we're seeing a mix of this now. And the question is, how do we respond? Because it's kind of easy to know if someone's presenting evidence, you listen to the case, you hear it out, just like a jury would hear a defendant or a prosecutor, you know, bringing the evidence, and then you weigh it through intelligence and through what you know, and then you listen to the arguments and you come to a conclusion. But when someone says, I had a dream, you've got to look at that differently. And here's what's interesting about the humanistic thinkers from the early 1900s is that they've kind of been proven wrong at this point. So here's and they absolutely have been proven wrong, actually, if you look at the data. So this is a thesis that I pulled up from Dominika Motok. It's called Postmodern Spirituality and the Culture of Individualism. Mm-hmm. In the introduction, the first thing that they state is, in recent years, the thesis about a fundamental shift in Western religiosity has become increasingly prominent in the scientific study of religion. Let me read a quick quote from this, and then we're going to jump into this conversation. The radical distinction between the temporal and supernatural worlds disappears, which seems to herald the advent of a new type of spirituality based on the idea of immanence. This new all-inclusive spirituality, quote unquote, has many forms of expression and is concerned with the sacredness of life, nature, and the universe, and all pathways that lead to meaning and purpose. This subjective turn means a turn away from life lived in terms of external or objective roles. So what they're saying is it means it's a subjective turn towards spirituality. Life is turning away from a place of being lived in external or objective roles. So that's an external version of religion. Like, here's the organized religion. It's an external thing that's affecting my life. Or here's an objective view of religion. So there is a God. He has a standard. Here's the rule book. All these things. And then watch this: roles, duties, and obligations, and a turn towards life lived by reference to one's own subjective experiences, and then relational as much as individualistic. So they're saying there's this turn, and I apologize for saying that this is a quote from the actual study. It's a quote from the summary of the study, but they're describing this study and this thesis. And what it's saying is there's a turn towards spirituality being based on how one individually feels or views the world. It's a subjective experience now, but it's still around, and it's actually increasing. Counterpunch released this article in 2020. These days, it seems that people have plenty of trouble with religion, but rather adore the idea of spirituality. It pervades the consumerist culture, and one cannot travel the contemporary cultural landscape without encountering it. Okay, so back to Candace, and we're going to get into some of this stuff as soon as we hear a quick message from our sponsor. But this is an important conversation. That's why we're having it. So y'all stick around. Investing can be confusing and scary, but it doesn't have to be. Genesis Gold Group takes the guessing out of the game and guides you on your gold investment journey. We at Filibusted love the genius design of the Prepper Bar, which breaks up into sections, kind of like a chocolate bar. But if you prefer high security insured gold storage, they have that too. And unlike Fort Knox, the gold is actually there, 100% owned by you. So don't wait to get started. Visit filibustedgold.com today for a free investment guide from Genesis Gold Group. So Doug, what are your initial thoughts on this? What Candace has said about this dream about Charlie, and we can get into some of the other things she said as well. But I want to hear what you're thinking, and then I want to get into some thoughts that I've had as well.
Well, I think first, it seems as though she might have just unintentionally done herself a disservice by not really explaining it further, because as far as like the one Charlie Kirk dream goes, she didn't say a lot about it other than just he came to visit me, which, depending on how you word your statements, is like people are going to respond accordingly. So that's the kind of statement that would naturally cause people to freak out. But I have a tendency to try to give benefit of the doubt, even with people that I don't agree with typically. And not that that's the case with Candace, because honestly, I actually probably do agree with her more often than not. But I try to just give benefit of the doubt in the fact that she's a human and she probably just said it. And regardless of the fact that she probably should be more careful because of her influence, she might do well to follow up and be like, hold on, let me clarify some things, but we'll see, because, I think we'll just get into some of your points and I'll have more thoughts on it, but point by point after that. But that was my initial maybe you should have thought about that.
Yeah, I think we're getting an interesting look at, a side of an influencer. And obviously we're talking about Candace Owens, right? But if you think about any influencer, who's in a niche, a niche, they deal with niche topics. Mm-hmm. Like, you're going to see a certain part of their life, and that's all you're going to see. Right. I'm kind of like the idea of, we back in the day, you didn't know all the grimy details about actors and actresses. It's like, unless you're reading the fan magazines or whatever, but then now you know everything. So it's like, oh, they're a Scientologist. I didn't, maybe I don't like them so much now. You know what I mean? So it's like, all the things. You see there's another side to their life that you didn't know about. And I think that's what's happening. There's something bleeding over here. Obviously, Candace is revealing part of what she believes, or part of, how she lives her life that maybe she didn't reveal before. But yeah,
I think more complex than that too. I mean, yes, we get to see a lot more of the inner workings of people these days, especially when they are podcasters, because it's kind of more real life based stuff. But at the same time, There's no way to get to know somebody and who they are and what they believe and how they really perceive the world without really just being very close to that person. It's just not possible. So there are going to be elements and complexities and layers behind who she is as a person that would contribute to her presenting this information in this way. And we will never be able to have the full picture of it, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that reminds me, we recently released a little mini documentary on this channel, Filibusted, called Becoming Candace, and we kind of talk about, we show like some of the influences of Candace's life as she grew up and why, maybe trying to answer that question, why is she the way she is? So if y'all haven't watched that, go check it out. But yeah, this is interesting. I want to get into a few of the other things she said, because right before this, you see on screen here, she's talking about these text messages with her producer. And so one of the things she said was, she said that she had texted her producer a couple of years back because she had a dream that her then producer was pregnant with a baby boy in 2023. And then in real life said, hey, you're pregnant, just so you know it's a boy. And then she found out that she was pregnant 1 week later, Candace says in the video. And she says, I believe people can communicate in dreams on their way in and on their way out of this world. Mm-hmm. So she's making a very clear statement about her belief there, which I think is interesting. So I think what she's saying, if I'm not wrong, is she's saying Charlie was leaving so he could communicate, and this baby was coming in so they could communicate their existence. Maybe, if I'm not wrong, I could be misinterpreting her statement there.
That's how I would interpret it.
That's how it seems. So I want to get into and then, obviously she talks about having this dream where she said, Charlie came to me and told me he was betrayed. So I want to get into my thought. Okay. So this is what I believe we're dealing with, is that there's 5 initial responses that I had, depending on where this lands. Okay. The first one is Candace could be making it up, right? Now, I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe she's just sitting there making stuff up, just for the sake of it or whatever. I don't think she's lying about it, right? It seems like she's telling the truth. Mm-hmm. As far as having the dream, okay?
She has no lack of sensational topics to cover. So,
right.
Not like she was doing it for the views.
Exactly. So the second option is that she's telling the truth and she just had a weird dream, right? She had a weird dream. It was a pizza dream. Whoop, it was random. I'm about to knock my mic over. And it's like that can happen. That could be what's happening here, right? Number 3, it could be that she had a real visitation from Charlie, but here's my thought on that is Candace claims to be a Christian, obviously Catholic, not Protestant. So there's a little bit of a distinction there, but there is, in my knowledge, there's not room from a biblical perspective as a Christian for somebody coming to you and visiting you from the supernatural world, unless that, as a human, right? Whether that be a baby or somebody that's died. So if that's her theology, I definitely disagree with her on that. What are your thoughts on that one, Doug? But I will say that this one seems like, based on what she's saying, this seems like the most likely one that she believes. And I've got 2 more in a second. What are your thoughts?
Well, so first of all, I think it's important to note a few things. Number 1, for anybody who's been following me for any amount of time, you'll probably not be surprised at the fact that I'm a little bit more open-minded when it comes to the supernatural stuff. I personally just believe that the supernatural is simply science not yet understood, right? In general, not all of it. Obviously there are some things that are not real, period. But there are other things that are real, experiences that are real. And I think sometimes there's an explanation, we just don't know what it is, which we can go throughout history and find many examples of that. And second, I will say that I personally know and have had similar experiences in this realm. So I would hazard to say that I do think that there is room for it from a Christian perspective. And that's based on personal experience. Not that I've had anything crazy, but I do think that there's nuance to it and it needs to be explained a little bit better. And not that she has to explain herself, because maybe she just feels like she doesn't owe an explanation and that's her prerogative. But I will say that I do think that there is a place for that. There is an example. I'm trying to figure out how to say this without like giving names or anything like that, because this is a very personal story. But I do know of, or at least my wife has had an experience with some of her family where she has had an exchange like that. Not her personally, but her family members have had an exchange from one person on their way out of this world who came and stopped by to visit another person who was also kind of like in that in-between realm. All Christians, all Jesus proclaiming, very biblically based people, and it was odd and very supernatural and even kind of like eerie in a sense. But and these were not people who would just make this stuff up. So
right. I think my pushback on that, Doug, is couldn't that be? Well, let me share the last two.
Sure.
The fourth and fifth one is she could have had a dream about Charlie that was actually sent from God. So it was like it wasn't Charlie himself, but it was a dream that God gave her where, looked like Charlie, a message from God, essentially, which is biblical, very biblical. And the fifth one would be she had a dream about Charlie, but it was actually demonically inspired, either an evil spirit visiting her or just a demonically inspired dream. Because demonization is also very biblical, and it happens a lot in scripture. So it could be one of those. So couldn't even that experience that your family member had, couldn't that be like number 2, 4, or 5, that it was just a weird dream, a coincidence, or
this is a very important distinction. This one particular thing that I'm talking about, the person who was on their way out when they came to visit the person who was still here was with Jesus in the visitation. So, and it was immediate too. That person had literally just died with like that day, and they came to stop by and like quote unquote to visit, and they were being encouraging. They said something very encouraging and positive to this other person, and they were with Jesus in this dream visitation thing that happened. And so I think that, like, not that it has to always have Jesus in the dream or visitation, but it definitely puts an extra little bit of a stamp of approval on it when that's the whole vibe behind it. And also the positive message aligning with biblical values and fruits and all of that. Like, you really have to have a conglomerate of things to make it make more sense in that way. Otherwise, it is up for debate. It could very well be a spiritual thing on the nefarious side where there's a manipulation taking place. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong, though. Look at the story of the Witch of Endor. Saul was not supposed to be doing what he was doing when he went and contacted that witch and got her to conjure up the spirit of Samuel. And there's a lot of different opinions on how this works, scholarly, but I personally believe that it really was Samuel, because he really was mad at Saul. And so it's like, the Bible doesn't say that it's an allegory. It literally states it as like, this is a thing that happened. And so since it's possible, but it was
I think
used,
that's a good theological interpretation of that story. I think maybe where you and I disagree on that story of Samuel coming back is that it was somehow the Witch of Endor's power or connection to the supernatural or occult or whatever that caused Samuel to come back. And my interpretation or my belief is that God stepped in and said, okay, no, I am going to bring Samuel back for a moment, or at least give him saw a vision of Samuel or whatever, whichever one it might've been, but that God stepped in, and that's why he got a real message from Samuel instead of, whatever.
Which is
normally
totally, like, plausible. But the Bible
that would be my thought. That's based on my theology, though. So obviously, we differ slightly on that. So my theology would put, if this was a real supernatural event that Candace had, it would put it in the, and even your relative, it would put it in the category of, if it wasn't like just a weird dream that was coincidental, it would put it in the category of 4 or 5. So it's either God showing a vision of that person or giving a dream of that person just to say, hey, just to encourage them, say, hey, they're with me. You don't need to worry, but it was a message from God, not necessarily a message from that person, not necessarily a visitation, or it was a demonic thing and it was supposed to confuse or scare or whatever, which obviously that wasn't the case, with your wife's relative,
Right.
So, but all that to say is it's like the way we deal with what Candace is saying has just completely changed.
That's true.
Like this is not, I'm going to go take this evidence and I'm going to go weigh it and I'm going to look at the, the facts that she's presenting. It's like, no, to me as a Christian, the only response at this point now is to pray about it. Like that's the only response possible in my mind. It's like, and a non-Christian may go do something. Well, I'm going to go do this or I'm going to go that. It's like, well, I wouldn't do those things. If it's a weird spiritual thing, don't do that. But as a Christian, I'm like, yeah, that's my only response is like, there's nothing else I can do besides pray about it and say, Lord, what is really going on here? Is this 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 or something else, that I missed? Like,
which is what I hope she has done. Hopefully that was her first step when she woke up from that dream. And that's because I have some crazy dreams sometimes too. And one of the first things I do is I take it to the Lord in prayer, and I'm like, is this something I need to pay attention to, or is this something I can disregard? And I get an answer every time. And I hope she did that with that dream, but she didn't say whether or not she did. So I don't know. If she wants to take this spiritual, maybe she should have followed up with that. But once again, her prerogative on whether or not she feels like she needs to explain herself.
Yeah. And I think one thing that to me, I'm like, it highly concerns me. Because what you just said, I hope that she did that. Obviously, we don't know if she did that or not. But she concluded after she told this story of Charlie visiting her in a dream, whether that's a dream from God, a demonic, a bad pizza dream, a coincidence, whatever it may be. It's like, she says this, she says, take that to the bank. Quote me on that. Women tend to have a stronger intuition about people, I would say. And so I'm like, okay, that phrase to me is concerning because it's like, okay, are you leaning on, my question is, does that mean you're leaning on God, or are you leaning on your intuition to tell you what this is?
Good point.
Like, which is it's a distinction, and it's like, and I'm not saying I'm perfect at that, and that I always get that right, or that any Christian does, it's like, I'm not saying that, but I think that is a good question to ask. Is like,
and you could be talking semantics too, because maybe that was the assumption in her mind, is like, well, yeah, women have more intuition as by divine providence, like a gift from God. Women have more intuition, but she just didn't say that part. Maybe, I don't know.
It could be, and I know it could be, and I know influencers use certain words to try to stay away from saying certain things. So it's like, she could be saying something she's not saying that, and I get that. But that's the question. That's my concern, where I'm just like, it is concerning to me. If that's something that she's sharing without praying about it, it is concerning to me. So
I do generally believe in the same, but I do believe that women are more intuitive. But I would follow up with that and say, because God made them that way, like that was their design. And there might be some science behind it that we just don't know yet. And it'd be really cool to find out why and how that all works. But for now, we can just say, like, women they are generally more intuitive, in my opinion. But that's on purpose for whatever reasons.
Right. And obviously they say we have 5 senses or whatever, and that's not necessarily true. I mean, even researchers and studies, they have the whole idea of like the quote unquote sixth sense. Like, I'm seeing ghosts or whatever. I watched that movie, The Sixth Sense, when I was probably 13 or something, in Spanish, because I was in Mexico and we didn't know what we were watching. Me and my brother just turned on the TV. We're alone. Just turned the TV on. We're watching it, and like we had no idea what we're watching. We're watching it in Spanish, and I'm like, and suddenly I was like, I think he's dead. Like halfway through the movie, I was like, I think and I like guessed the
language barrier helped you with that big reveal, huh?
What?
The language barrier helped you with that big reveal. You had to rely on
100%. The missing understanding of what was being said in the conversations made the actions and the behavior very clear to me. I was like, nobody's interacting with it.
Interesting.
But that idea of, a sixth sense, it's like there is research today that shows like, no, there is something else going on. And I honestly believe what that is, well, it's because we're spiritual beings, like there is a spirit world. It's not just the natural. It's not just physical. The humanistic viewpoint is not the only one there is, so I want to bring a couple, but here's the thing is I feel really sorry for people that are not Christians because they don't have connection to the source of truth that Christians have. Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And God has given us 2, what I would say are staples when it comes to wisdom and understanding and navigating the world we live in. The first one is the Bible, and the second one is the Holy Spirit. And so I want to give 3 verses that came to mind. The first one is James 1:5. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. So we have, as Christians, we have the ability to ask God for wisdom and believe that we're actually going to receive the wisdom we need. 1 Samuel 16:7 says, God does not see as man sees, since man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So God is able to look at things on the inside that we're not going to see, and there's no other way to judge that or to understand what's going on except for the spiritual, except for through God's wisdom.
Yeah, that's good.
Here's the last one, 1 Corinthians 2:10. These are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. So the Holy Spirit is able to reveal things to us. And that's not always in dreams. I think God can do that, and he does, but it's not always in words that God can do that, and he does. But I think it's also just through supernatural wisdom, and revelation in different ways. So anyways, those are my final thoughts. Any concluding thoughts, Doug?
Well, I sent you that fun picture, and I was going to tell this little story. Yeah. So, because you mentioned one of the options is
here's a gross picture.
Yeah, here's a gross picture. One of the options
looks really good. Is that weird?
Was pizza? What do you call like you had to like it's pizza?
Pizza dream, yeah.
Yeah, pizza dream. So I will say that what you eat does definitely affect how you sleep. I was recently on a little tiny vacation to the coast with some friends, and they had this on the menu, and I love crazy weird things, so I had to try it. It was called the Kraken. This thing right here was at least half a pound of octopus.
Wow.
Massive. And I ate every last bite because it was delicious. I know it does not look delicious, but
it actually looks really good to me. I think that's weird, but it does. Like
it was tender and amazing, like the sauce. Anyway, so really, really good. And later that night, obviously, I went to bed eventually, and I woke up the next morning, and I had to write down some of the dreams I had because they were so vivid and lucid, and it felt like I was communicating with some sort of like entity. I don't know, it was weird, but I'm not demonic, not in any sort of weird way, but like, and I'm being facetious now at this point, but I had some crazy dreams. So speaking of like pizza dreams, there's that's a real thing. And if you want to really up the ante on that, eat some octopus. I am
half a pound of octopus, and you're going to have some wild dreams tonight.
Pretty dang convinced after that octopus is actually not of this world. Like it must be alien. I don't know, because it made me think some strange things, and I was like, "Ooh, I don't know how I feel about that."
Oh my gosh, yeah, I love that. Well, I'm gonna have to go try some octopus sometime because
it was
probably grossing people out right now.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, thanks for joining me, Doug. I'm gonna call it quits. But yeah, this is a good conversation. I think it's one that we're probably gonna have to continue. But I would encourage every person. Before you come to conclusions about things like this, make sure you pray about it. Take it to the Lord. Read the word, and we will see you next time. Gold is not just a backup plan if the world falls apart. It's an investment opportunity that could set you up for generations. There's never really a bad time to invest in gold, but you want to make sure you have the right guide. And that is where Genesis Gold Group shines. Whether you are a first-time buyer or a seasoned investor, their trusted expertise and competitive pricing makes them an easy choice. They offer tangible assets in case of emergencies, but they can also design the perfect IRA just for you. And they'll even cut through all that confusing red tape from the IRS. We at Filibusted love the genius design of the Prepper Bar, which breaks up into sections like a chocolate bar. But if you prefer a more high-security insured gold storage, they have that too. And unlike Fort Knox, the gold is actually there and 100% owned by you. Genesis Gold Group is a safe, simple, and convenient way to invest. Visit filibustedgold.com today for your free investment guide from Genesis Gold Group.